So let's look again at this, some of these charts that we kind of hinted at last week. We got Daniel, 70th week of Daniel, where this is just one time frame. You don't have to agree with it. Where it talks about at the far left, the 444 BC, the decree of Artaxerxes. Some people say that time frame is not quite accurate. It's really the decree of Cyrus that started this 490 years. Either way, it either dead ends at the Messiah being cut off at 33 AD, or it dead ends at the destruction of Jerusalem, the 483 years. So whether you move it up a little bit or back a little bit, slide that scale, I'm not really that picky about that, where the decree started. But there was a decree to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And Daniel describes it as 7 weeks of 49 years, and then we got the 62 week of 434 years, totaling of 483 years. You can see that big cross kind of in the middle where Messiah is cut off. You can say that's Christ, the Messiah. Or some people say that this is some type of anointed person that's cut off, but not necessarily Messiah himself, because the word Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, simply means anointed one. Could be someone else that we're talking about. I'm not saying there's another Messiah. Don't misunderstand me. I'm saying that the prophecy could allow for that it's Jesus that's in there, or that it's just a very important religious person that fit that bill. But either way, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD is really kind of one of the stop ends of the 483 years, where we might say the beginning of the gap, the church age. You can see that kind of the red arrow there at the bottom kind of comes in. That's what I call the mystery of the gospel, the mystery of the Gentiles being brought in. That is a reality to us now. And it's not like it was plan B to God. Remember, it's called a mystery because we in the Old Testament didn't see it. But God saw it because he can see the future from the beginning. And so from his perspective, it was always part of his plan, which means in hindsight, which is always 2020, right? In hindsight, the gap was always supposed to be there. And we call it a gap because it's longer than the 490 years will allow by any stretch of the imagination. Therefore, it must be a gap that's included in there. I keep emphasizing this because there are some people who say, well, there isn't any gap. That's the preterist view, the view that all of history has been closed up in that time. But then how do the preterists explain the last 70th week? How do they explain Daniel? How do they explain that Yeshua said that there's something future? How do they explain John's revelation that talks about events that are clearly future with detail that even by an allegorical stretch of the imagination can't have happened yet? Right? The preterist perspective, in my opinion, has some fatal flaws. Particularly one of them is the rapture, which is also a mystery. Paul talks about how that the resurrection, the snatching away, the catching up into the air, where we receive new bodies in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he uses the word mystery again. What does that tell me? That means the rapture wasn't foreseen in the Tanakh. It's not part of the Old Testament prophecies in black and white and right in your face. There are types and shadows of raptures that take place in the Old Testament, right? Elijah being taken up in a whirlwind into heaven. Okay, that's a kind of a rapture, right? Enoch walked with God and wasn't found anymore because God took him. Okay, that's kind of a taken up bodily to be with God. So there are kind of types and shadows of raptures that took place in the Old Testament. But by and large, the event that's going to be a worldwide event where Yeshua collects all of his faithful, both living and dead, to be with him, right, that we read about in the New Testament, the snatching away, the resurrection, our blessed hope that Peter talks about, or that Jude talks about, that is actually a mystery. It was a mystery to the Old Testament saints. They didn't see that. God didn't give them that. That's why it's called, you ready for it? A mystery. That's part of the gap, because when this gap comes to an end, as it were, we say Antichrist's covenant with the Jews, 70th week, 70th advent of Messiah. Somewhere in there we have to factor in the rapture, which again, that either takes place at the beginning of the 70th week, right, the beginning of the last final 7 years, in the middle of it, or somewhere right up the middle, or maybe at the very end, depending on what your theology is. So let's look at another version of this map. Again, same concept, a giant picture of 70 weeks, 490 years, with Daniel's prophecy at the far left revealed, and then just going from left to right. Artaxerxes' decree, or you could say Cyrus' decree. Again, I know some people go one or the other, and there's a difference of like almost 50 years between the two, or 30 years between which decree you think is when this began. And depending on where you start the beginning of the 69 weeks, it will cause your ending to be either as early as the triumphal entry of Yeshua in the 30s, or it'll be as late as the destruction of the temple in the 70s of the first era. In other words, there's like that 40-year difference between those windows. Again, I'm not going to say which one is the best view, because they both accomplish the same purpose. They both cover the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and then the sacking of both of them once again by 70 AD. So they both kind of end up with the same kind of net effect. So I'm not going to argue. It's not a point of contention for me. But either way, you have to kind of the same general time frame. 69 weeks are kind of clustered together. And then we've got this church age current gap, which again, I'm confident that this is the times of the Gentiles, the fullness of the Gentiles that must come in, that Paul talked about. It's the age of Gentile domination, of, from Israel's perspective, a domination of either the city of Jerusalem and or the people of Israel not having total autonomy over that part of their land because of the Gentile influences around them, right? I'm not saying that Israel's at war with the Gentiles. I'm simply saying that they don't have complete control to make all the policies that they'd like to for all. I mean, think about it right now. In 2023, the Jewish people still cannot go up on the Temple Mount and pray. Why? Because it's Muslim controlled, okay? And it's been that way ever since Jerusalem got destroyed and the Muslims came, Islam came in. But even before that, when the Romans sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD with Titus armies and things like that, and Israel got plowed under, the city of Jerusalem has just been a mess since 70 AD. She's not been fully functional, right? The temple has not been rebuilt for almost 2,000 years. So that's the gap. And so that didn't take God by surprise. It would take the prophets of old by surprise. Paul was given this mystery, right? He revealed it, and he was the apostle to the Gentiles to explain how, because of this blindness, the Gentiles have been brought in to this relationship with God in mass, right? Instead of just trickling in one here and one there. And then got the 70 week on the far end, far right, where we're going to see this time period pick up again. Let's look at the preterist version of that. Again, 70 weeks, 490 years. From the preterist perspective on the far left, 455 BC, the word to restore Jerusalem. And then we got the 7 weeks of 49 years. Then we got the 62 weeks of 434 years. Blow that up a little bit. And you can see as we cross over from BC to CE, Jerusalem is rebuilt. Messiah arrives in 29 or around 30. And then from the preterist perspective, the counting never stopped. There was no gap. Messiah was cut off around 33, and then around 36, you've got the end of the 70th weeks, and you've got a picture of a Roman there. So I guess that's Titus with 36. I don't know what they're trying to say, what 36 is exactly, but somehow the temple gets destroyed a little later on in 70, and then for them, there's no gap, which means, I guess for them, the rapture took place already, or there is no rapture, there is no resurrection. I mean, that's why the preterist view, in my opinion, is the weakest of all those four. We're talking about the historicist, the preterist, the futurist, and the idealist. We didn't even bring in the eclectic version, but of all those four views, the preterist I may think is the weakest one, especially when we're talking about the rapture and the resurrection. I mean, what do they do with that? So that's their version. One last resource you can do, again, same time period. This one's the final 70th week, this last week as well. 7-year period, 1 week, 7 years. We got 7 years broken up into 3.5 and 3.5. There are verses that talk about how this is 1,260 days and 1,260 days, so 3.5 and 3.5 years. Covenant peace treaty was made with Israel and the surrounding people groups so that they can kind of have this peace agreement between them. That's not going to be a secret, right? I think there's no one in the world, no country in the world that will be unaware of this peace treaty that's made between Israel and her surrounding neighbor groups. I mean, at the very least, we're talking about something that will allow Israel to begin worshiping on the Temple Mount again. That, again, won't be a secret to the world. 3.5 years into this, The Antichrist is going to defile whatever religious edifice was erected at that time, whether it be a full-blown temple or some type of a portable tabernacle structure. We don't know. But he's going to sit in that temple and defile it and bring that system crashing down for the Jewish people. And then at that point in time, an abomination of desolation takes place. Of course, that's Daniel talking, Yeshua confirming. And at that point in time, persecution is going to ramp up, not just for Jews, but for Christians as well, because the Antichrist is going to demand worldwide worship at that point in time. To read the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians books, which we're going to reference here tonight. Great tribulation will start, if it hasn't already been going on, right? The growing pains of the 4 horses of the apocalypse in the first 3.5 years will have already been taking place. What the book of Revelation calls seals 1 through 3 and 4 or so. That's the 4 horses of the apocalypse. You guys know what I'm talking about. The white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the red horse, and the pale horse. I think I've got them out of order. I think it's black, red. I think it's white, red, black, and then pale, something like that. But that's the first half of the week. And then the second half is the really bad stuff, the great tribulation, the Antichrist just going wild, the devil going wild, killing anyone and everyone who doesn't take the mark and bow to him and to confess that he's God. Of course, Christians and Jews and a lot of other peoples, not just Christians and Jews, but there are a lot of people who are going to resist, and the devil doesn't care. So it's going to be like off with your head. That'll be the final 3.5 years. Somehow we will be raptured out either prior to all of the bad stuff happening at the very beginning, or in the midpoint. If you're a mid-tripper, or if you're a pre-wrather like me, it'll be after the midpoint but before the ending. So sometime maybe like 2/3 of the way in. Or if you're a post-tribber, the rapture, you're going to go through an entire 7 years of hitting the fan, and you won't get raptured until the final end. But eventually at the very end, the devil, the Antichrist, the false Messiah, the false prophet, they're all going to launch some intense military campaign against God, against his Messiah. They're going to mass around Jerusalem near the area of Armageddon, or Jerusalem, and or both, that whole part of the Middle East. Maybe the kings of the East will be coming out from the Euphrates River side of the world. Maybe an army from China or something like that, from India, who knows, Russia swooping down from the north. This giant, massive, last-ditch effort from the Satan to overthrow God's people and God's regime and God's system of things, and just wipe out any remnant of God's people, Jews and Christians alike. I don't think the devil, in my opinion, I don't think the devil views non-Jews as God's people unless you're Christians. In other words, I am of the impression that unless you're part of Israel or part of Christianity, the devil doesn't particularly see you as a major threat. So if you're of a type of religion that's non-Jewish, non-Christian, you fall into the kind of the camp of you're on the devil's side kind of by default. In other words, the book of Revelation talks about how the devil, in chapter 12, near the very end, how Satan is thrown down to earth and goes off to make war with those who are the offspring of the woman, i.e. Israel, and those who keep the testimony of Jesus. That would be the Christians. But not just Christians, but also Messianic Jews. But he doesn't say anything about those who are of other religions, right? So that's the point I'm trying to make, is the tribulation is going to be a time of intense persecution for genuine Christians, but also for just Jewish people, or those who are going to remain loyal to the covenant of Moses. So people of the book, right, is the point I'm trying to make. People of both the Old and New Testament. So those are some charts that we kind of talked about. When we're looking at these key scriptures, though, let's go back now. So that's Daniel's. From an overview, Daniel's prophecies are key when we're talking about studying end-time events. Number 2, the Olivet Discourse. It was the Lord Yeshua HaMashiach who taught about the sign of his second coming on the Mount of Olives during the final week of his life on earth. What he said ought to parallel what the scripture teaches in other places, since Messiah is the author of the visions of Daniel, right? Compare from Daniel 10:5-6, compare with Revelation 1:13-16. I'll have an overlay graphic sometime later on in my study that shows how what Yeshua talks. Maybe I have it here. Maybe give me a second. Yeah, we'll see this tonight. Where what Yeshua talks about, maybe tonight, maybe next week, depends how much time I have. What Yeshua lays down in Matthew 24 and its synoptic versions of Mark 13 and Luke 17, this Olivet Discourse matches perfectly what Yeshua gave to John in the book of Revelation as well. Same author, right? Yeshua in Matthew, Mark and Luke, and Yeshua in John. So that makes sense why they should compare and match with one another. So these are the instructions known as the Olivet Discourse. And the book of Revelation is part of that kind of extended look at end-time events. I go on to say that when the sequence in Matthew 24, 3-31 is examined, it will be found to parallel what Shaul taught in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 and 2 Thessalonians, particularly chapters 1 and 2, and what we read in Revelation. So let's look at part of this real quick as well tonight. So we got Matthew 24. It's labeled in the NASB version of my Bible, signs of Christ's return at the very beginning, Matthew 24. And the entire chapter is given over to Yeshua explaining signs of not just his return, right, which include both rapture as well as second coming, but also it's signs of what we now know as the day of the Lord, this final intense wrath of God and judgment and tribulation that's going to be poured out, not just on the wicked systems of the world, but the tribulation and the time period that's going to be coming upon the world is to purify national Israel and to separate the wheat from the chaff and to purify the compromising and dead church, right?